Esta es la alabanza. Es la symphony
Perfecto. Ahí.
Esta es la alabanza.
Un poquito, por favor.
Es la symphony total. Sí, y el symphony total. Y ahí acá tenemos para mí para
Bueno, un poquito menos, un poquito menos. Un poquito. Ok, más o menos por ahí. Well, that is very briefly what happens. Okay. A la presentación, por favor. Gracias. Right. Thank you so much.
This is a presentation.
Yeah, okay. Coatlicue's story is unique since she was. Ahora se rebota el sonido, ¿verdad? Es que ahora el sonido como que se rebota. Me encanta el efecto, pero. A ver. Exacto. Eso me pasa por meterme con esas deidades.
Are there questions? Claudia? Fernando.
Muchas gracias a los tres. Las tres han sido ponencias muy diferentes, pero muy interesantes. Quería hacer una pregunta a Marisa. Me interesó mucho ese códice, bueno, o ese documento de las ordenanzas. Pero durante tu presentación has dicho que se ha cuestionado la autenticidad de ese documento, la época de ese documento. Es exactamente, bueno. Es un poquito mi pregunta va por ese sentido, porque en principio parece muy interesante cómo están delimitando un espacio. Por eso también esto me interesa mucho lo de la crítica o la controversia sobre cuándo se hizo ese documento, porque por una parte es muy interesante saber si ese documento se hizo en el 16, porque está marcando cómo están concibiendo el espacio unas culturas prehispánicas, porque se ha hablado mucho que los lienzos coloniales, muchos de ellos se hicieron también a partir del siglo XVI por las necesidades españolas de delimitar territorios. Entonces es otra concepción que viene de fuera, que está intentando sobre el espacio imponer otra visión del espacio, otra concepción del mundo y poner esos límites muy precisos. Entonces, es muy interesante ese documento, pero también es lo controvertido. ¿Realmente está reflejando una visión del siglo XVI o es una visión más del siglo XVIII que está más contaminada ya por en el sentido de que son mojoneras y es el espacio entre los recursos, que si la acusas que puede utilizar una comunidad o la otra? Entonces, ¿hasta qué punto? Porque también es muy interesante en mi trabajo también, lo que está observando mi trabajo sobre arte rupestre y paisaje cultural, es que los sitios sagrados son un referente indiscutible entre comunidades, pero no como formar un límite, como una línea, sino es otro tipo de referencia, otro tipo de, para mostrar cuáles son los espacios, y no son espacios a la manera europea, es otro tipo de concepción del espacio. Entonces, por ahí va un poquito mi pregunta, ¿hasta qué punto ese documento es antiguo o es más refleja, si el 7-18 más refleja una concepción del espacio europeo?
Sí, gracias por la pregunta, me da ocasión de explicar un poco. Yo creo que el documento es muy antiguo, se dice que de 1523, eso suena un poco difícil, porque suena difícil que, o sea, lo que se dice es que Cuauhtémoc en su cautiverio le dijo a los nobles, hay que reforzar estos acuerdos entre Ixcoatl y Cuauhtlatoa, que eso sí está documentado en muchos documentos, ¿no? El acuerdo que hubo después de que ganan la guerra contra Azcapotzalco. Hay un problema, digamos, entre los límites, que es una cosa que tienes mucha razón. En realidad estamos hablando de límites lacustres prácticamente, porque es el cerro de Tepetzingo en línea recta, digamos, hacia Tlatelolco, ¿no? María Castañeda cuestiona si realmente estamos hablando de un documento tan antiguo o no. Ella piensa que es un documento del 18. Yo tengo o sea, no considero que sea un documento del 18. Sí la controversia, digamos, o porque se da a conocer estas ordenanzas, es por este pleito de 1704 entre un supuesto propietario de Tepetzingo contra los tlatelolcas, que eso, o sea, constantemente había problemas en ese sentido, pero quizás no sea tan temprano como 1523, pero sí, yo sí creo que sea del 16 porque tiene la procesal. O sea, está hecho con procesal y realmente el estilo no corresponde a un documento tan tardío, del 18. O sea, realmente está escrito. Yo creo, lo que piensa Perla y yo me adhiero más a esa, o sea, ni tan temprano ni tan tardío. Yo creo que es un documento del 16 porque usa letra del siglo XVI, ¿no? Y posiblemente, como la misma Perla Valle dice, es copia de otro documento. O sea, al parecer había un documento que fijaba, digamos, una controversia entre mexicas y tlatelolcas respecto al uso de la pesca, porque realmente en tiempos muy tempranos no había, digamos, todavía tantas chinampas, entonces la principal fuente de provisionamiento de recursos era la pesca, ¿no? Hay muchos documentos que hablan sobre los diferentes recursos y los territorios que pertenecían a Tlatelolco. Ya no me puede, digamos, extender eso, pero Tlatelolco iba hasta Cuautitlán en cuanto a sus dominios, ¿no? Y al parecer al oriente estaba Tepetzingo. Entonces, los anales de Cuautitlán, los anales de Tlatelolco. Entonces, María dice que, María Castañeda, que como que es un documento que están refiriéndose a la crónica X y que todos están tomando el mismo documento, pero eso para mí no es suficiente argumento para pensar que es un documento tan tardío. O sea, por el estilo, digamos, del documento, no parece un documento, no parece, digamos, un manuscrito hecho tan tardíamente como el 18, ¿no? O sea, ya, para mí, por ejemplo, un documento del 18 podría ser el Azcatitlan, que eso es algo que estoy trabajando, porque tiene un estilo completamente, se dice que es del 16, pero realmente no corresponde a toda la tradición indígena, digamos, de pictografías del siglo XVI. Entonces, por el estilo del documento, yo no creo que sea tan tardío, ¿no? Y sí hay referencias de Sagún de casi todos los lugares que se están representando en el mapa de las ordenanzas, donde se sabe que sí había rituales, ¿no? Donde se refrendaba o sacrificios o se celebraban ciertas festividades en las fiestas de las veintenas. Entonces, hay muchas referencias de que sí estos espacios son sagrados. Entonces, mi argumento es, bueno, si es un documento del 16 temprano o tardío, el hecho es que los tlatelolcas lo están sacando argumentando que había un acuerdo de 1430 entre Ixcoatl y Cuauhtlatoa, ¿no? Eso es, para mí es lo más importante, que los tlatelolcas hasta siglo XVIII reivindican los derechos de pesca, los derechos de explotación de las salinas, ¿no? Justamente ya no lo mencioné, pero Xaliyaca tiene un poco esa etimología de un lugar que estaba, digamos, más hacia el poniente, que hasta el siglo XVIII se sigue explotando para la producción de la sal. Entonces, todavía hay que seguir, digamos, investigando más para tratar de fechar mejor el documento, pero creo que el hecho de que se haga la alusión a un acuerdo pues muy temprano del siglo XV entre tlatelolcas y mexicas, lo que todo el tiempo estaban negociando sobre los límites. De hecho, la sequía, ¿no? Que es actualmente el eje 1 norte, era el límite entre los dos y siempre había conflicto por los límites entre las dos ciudades, que como se fueron cada vez uniendo más, pues los conflictos, digamos, se fueron incrementando hasta que tal llega el conflicto y la tensión entre ellos que en 1473, pues los mexicas finalmente conquistan o ganan la guerra contra Tlatelolco y pues todo lo que ya narré de que les imponen tributo, que ya no les permiten elegir a sus propios gobernantes, y lo que es muy interesante es que eso lo recuperan después de la conquista, ¿no? O sea, finalmente yo pienso que inclusive pudo haber sido una negociación. Si hay documentos que dicen que los tlatelolcas escriben directamente al rey, donde dicen que, bueno, ellos tienen esos derechos, ¿no? Entonces, me parece que son controversias que los tlatelolcas están metiendo en la discusión desde tiempos muy tempranos. Es difícil que un documento haya sido tan temprano, pero el estilo realmente sí, yo sí lo ubico en el siglo XVI, digamos, a lo mejor mediados del siglo XVI, hay mucha precisión, o sea, es un poco como decir, bueno, y el mapa de Uppsala, que es de 1550, pues realmente es muy preciso, ¿no? En cuanto a al albarradón de San Lázaro o antes de Ahuizot, o sea, hay muchas referencias geográficas como pues, digamos, nos permitan desestimar este documento como un documento, si no tan temprano, pues podría ser de mediados del siglo XVI, justo más o menos coincide con las razones por las cuales se hace el Códice de Tlatelolco, que tiene mucha relación, digamos, de cómo los tlatelolcas están argumentando todos los alianzas que hacen finalmente con los españoles en guerras de conquista, pero básicamente para conservar sus derechos ante la corona española, ¿no?
¿Otras intervenciones?
Gracias. Más que nada, nomás quería decir, Alesha, que me estuve acordando de el Museo Mexicano aquí en Chicago, con una comunidad grande de mexicanos. En los 90 tuvimos la exposición de La Reina de las Américas, que vino del Museo de Guadalupe en la Ciudad de México. Y esa exposición trajo tanta gente que no habían entrado a museos anteriormente, creo que ni en México ni aquí en Chicago. Y el problema más grande que tuvimos eran que llegaban con flores, llegaban con velas y no sé cuántas veces besaron una obra colonial, cruzaron y la besaron. Ese video que enseñaste me recordó mucho de esa experiencia y era obviamente Virgen de Guadalupe aquí en Chicago.
Gracias.
Sí, yo, bueno, nada más para complementar, hablé con Jorge Rubalcaba, que ha sido el director de Relaciones Públicas del Museo Nacional de Antropología durante décadas, y él me platicó que tuvieron que llegar a un acuerdo con los grupos de los danzantes para permitirles el ingreso ese día. Y de verdad es que lo que sucede es increíble porque hasta le tiran, yo creo que es una bebida alcohólica, no pregunté qué era, pero yo creo que es mezcal, ¿no? La tiran como una ofrenda y bañan al monolito, ¿no? O sea, yo no podía creer cuando estaba ahí, de verdad. O sea, yo pensaba que iban a entrar los danzantes, pero con caracoles, tambores y sahumerios prendidos, era, de verdad es increíble, pero es justamente eso, o sea, como que el museo permite este hecho religioso, pues una vez al año y terminando la ceremonia se barre, se limpia y vuelve a ser la sala mexica del Museo Nacional de Antropología. O sea, el sentido de lo sagrado se vuelve a transformar ahí, ¿no? Gracias, sí.
Bueno, felicidades a todos los ponentes. Mi pregunta es para Jamie. Thank you so much for that absolutely fascinating account of Dominican skullduggery. And I wanted to ask you to think a little bit more about the larger implications of this. Like, where else should we be looking for early secular foundations that have been erased? You know, like how does beyond Achutla, where does this take us?
Yeah, and yeah, my view of it is a little bit parochial, having been so focused on the Mixteca. And I mean, it's really hard with these seculars though, because I think they were really kind of like piecemeal scattered around all these places. So yeah, if you move up into yeah, so I would say if where you should be looking for them the most beyond like Oaxaca would be other places where the mendicant orders were relatively late arrivals rather than, you know, the Franciscans come first and they kind of stake out all the prime real estate in central Mexico. But in some of these other places where you have like these Augustinians, for example, who are really kind of like the third who come like after the Dominicans, there undoubtedly were seculars running around this place too. And it's just, it's so vexing, like one, because they don't leave the documentary footprint that these mendicant orders do. And even when they do things, it seems like sometimes the mendicants come in and they just tear down whatever they had built. So yeah, particularly in some of these peripheral areas where mendicant orders were a little bit later to arrive, I think that's where we should look hardest.
Behind the establishment of secular churches, the encomenderos.
Yeah, the encomenderos, at least theoretically, have an obligation to bring Christianity and build churches to these communities. And some take that charge more seriously than others do. I think in the case of Achutla, the encomendero there was this very kind of like close friend and ally of Hernan Cortez, who really got quite a nice encomienda that consisted over 9 different communities. And I think given that he, because wanting to maintain that level of privilege, like took his, the kind of responsibilities that came with it rather seriously.
Thank you.
It's okay? Okay, yes. Jamie, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. And I think it's very suggestive that this first church was built on the top of a mountain and was dedicated to the Calvary. And in very early times, can you dive deeper of why this relationship with Calvary?
Yeah, forgive me, I might not have.
And,
Mhm.
as a sacred place, I mean.
Yeah, I might not have explained that quite as well as I could have for the sake of brevity, but both of those churches are kind of like on, it's like the lower spur of a ridge that runs through the community, not precisely a mountaintop, but both those churches are kind of at a high point relative with respect to where the center of the community is today. But that population has moved down into the valley floor over time. So one of the things that gets confusing is yeah, that ruin today is called the El Calvario, but I think that's a reinterpretation of it in more recent times. It wouldn't have been considered a Calvario, yeah, in the 16th century. I've had a little bit of a fight with some colleagues who don't believe me that that's the first church, because they say, well, no, that was like a Calvario church, like for, you know, people when the Dominican church was up and running. But that doesn't really make sense, because if it were, making a pilgrimage from one church to the other would be like a leisurely 5-minute stroll down a hill, rather than a position upwards.
Okay, thank you.
You've been there.
Oh, thank you.
Yo quiero hacer un comentario. En el proyecto de pintura mural analizamos la tumba que está en Xochilquitongo, al norte de Oaxaca, o Huijatzó en zapoteco. Y se encontró que aunque la tumba está a 8 metros de profundidad hoy, el edificio de arriba está dirigido al norte. Y de acuerdo al códice Feye Valle Mayo, el norte está representando una deidad sin piel, descarnada. Se hizo una fotografía enfrente del edificio y se ve claramente arriba la estrella polar como eje del cielo y toda la bóveda girando. Entonces sería muy interesante en el caso del Calvario, de este sitio, que aunque está maltratado, sí se puede encontrar más o menos el eje de simetría y revisar hacia dónde está viendo. Pero si está viendo al norte, es congruente con la idea que el norte del cielo está asociado a la muerte.
Es una sugerencia muy provocativa. Es un poco difícil probarlo en más profundidad en estos días, porque pues esta zona arqueológica es bastante complejo. Hubo bajo bastantes complejos prehispánicos también, entonces es un poco difícil distinguir exactamente por qué construyeron un edificio en un lugar y otro en otro, pero eso es una sugerencia, sí, muy interesante.
Gracias. ¿Otro comentario? Bueno, voy a agradecer a los ponentes por su excelente trabajo.
Muchas gracias. Bien, gracias.
Por supuesto. Y vamos a seguir con la tercera mesa o third panel. No.
After this next panel, but everybody hold on. We'll try to make up as much time as we can. And our next panel is entitled Sacred Spaces on Paper. Our first speaker is Wei-Cheng, who is an associate professor in the Department of Art History here at the University of Chicago. His first book is called, just leave it, I'll fix it later. It's called Building a Sacred Mountain, Buddhist Architecture on China's Mount Wutai. And he's currently working on 2 new projects, one called Performative Architecture of China, and the other Necessarily Incomplete Fragments of Chinese Artifacts. His talk today is entitled Sacred Ephemera, China's Textual Pagodas.
All right, thank you, Claudia. And also I want to thank to the organizers for this opportunity. And obviously I'm representing East Asia, so for this conference, I wish I know better about Latin America, the history and culture, but I think I really am learning, from this conference. But I hope my paper will not be so, out of place. So hopefully, I'm sure I'm gonna benefit from your comments and questions. But hopefully, the paper will contribute to the discussion of the theme. All right, so
We're open.
okay, yeah. So I just click on this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. It seems like my image doesn't come out. I hope my image will come out. Okay, cool. Great. All right, so it's the best way to do this. Okay. So. Okay. I don't really need this. I'm gonna put it in the back. All right. So the topic of my talk today is the specific kind of pagoda images as shown on the screen now. So there are only 4 surviving examples in ink and paper dating back to the 9th century in Tang, China. Images of Buddhist sacred structures in different materials and mediums are among the Buddhist pictorial repertoire fully developed during the Tang Dynasty. What is unusual about this set of pagodas on paper is their contours and lines, which are made up of characters that spell a Buddhist scriptures, the Heart Sutra of the Perfection of Wisdom, better known as Heart Sutra. I will call these images textual pagodas in this presentation to contrast pictorial ones or 3-dimensional pagodas made of less perishable materials. So they are almost exactly the same. The 2 on your left have the images in the middle. The 2 on the right, in contrast, don't have that. I won't address the issue of the image in this presentation. But if you are interested, we can discuss that a little bit in the Q&A. Today I'm gonna use the central 2 images as my primary of examples. So. All right, so this set of textual pagodas along the thousands of manuscripts and paintings were uncovered from the 12th century secret depository in Dunhuang, a Buddhist site on China's northwestern border. We know very little about who made them or their initial functions and use context, yet the lack of knowledge didn't stop scholars from speculating about their intended meanings. What has interested scholars most is the intriguing design. It's the intriguing design. So arranging the characters into the pagoda image in such a way that it collapses the distinction and differences between the picture and word. Reading the text, one follows the red dotted lines, instructing which characters follows which until the text gradually configures the entire pagoda. So it's showing the detail on the one on the right, and then the detail, the one on the left right there. So you can see the underline, the network of the red dots. And my colleague, Elsner, Yashi Elsner also reconstruct the entire reading sequence. You can see the numbers. So we'll go throughout the entire pagoda. So by dictating the reading sequence that forms the pagoda, it has been suggested that the image becomes a theological reformulation of words and the visual form and exegesis of the textual content. The visual presentation, therefore, suggests a comprehension of the sutra by conflicting image and text, initially 2 different modes of signification. At least one scholar have using what we call a calogram as a contrast. So you can see that the writing is arranged in the pictorial form that's thematically related to the content of the text. So this and other similar analysis which hinge on the dual identity of the pagoda as an image and text, and the slippage between them are compelling. But they also seem to flatten the text of pagodas as some intellectual exercise for interpreting the meaning of sutra. We should be reminded that the building of pagodas flourished entering the Tang Dynasty. In this light, one question I would like to raise is how the emergence of the paper pagoda was related to the actual worshipping of pagodas in medieval China. The pagoda or stupa, its Indian prototype, is a structure built to enshrine the relics of the Buddha or virtuous beings. It has been built in China since the arrival of Buddhism in the 2nd and 3rd century CE, signaling the spread of the religion and its code of relics. As late as 6th century, it is recorded that copies of scriptures were also deposited inside pagoda for ritual veneration, thus regarding the Buddha's words as dharma relics, worthy of veneration, just like corporeal relics. For instance, 2 scrolls of Hot Sutra, I'm showing you one of the 2, handwritten by devout Buddhists in 1043, were deposited in the pagoda as dharma relics, along with physical relics. In fact, the devotion to the physical relics and scriptures was deemed 2 sides of the same coin in medieval China, in which physical relics and words of the Buddha are the content enshrined inside the pagoda as a container. In a sense, the container is the exterior, the visible manifestation of the content, which is hidden, invisible from outside. As such, the divide between the content and the container will render the slippage of the pagoda into scripture or vice versa of the textual pagodas problematic. So what I want to say is that, as you can see right there, the usual ways of thinking about pagoda is there's a relics inside. The other one, pagoda is outside. But the textual pagodas, you can see how the content becomes the content becomes the container in this way. So, in other words, the theological framing of the relic code in medieval China regarding the relics as content inside the pagoda as a container would necessarily challenge the approach to the textual pagoda that focuses on the symbiosis between sutra and pagoda. In this paper, instead of taking the duality of text and image as an interpretive device of the scripture, I argue that the mutuality of the container and the content serves to activate the sacred text to empower the pagoda by simulating ritual circumambulation. And it is through this activation that textual pagoda structures a virtual sacred space on paper. To see this, I propose to examine the textual pagoda not from the perspective of the image-word relation, but in the context of the relic code, to understand how its making and notion of sacred space took shape. So this is my first section. So in the legends of Buddhism's transmission to China, relics were indispensable for Chinese Buddhists to access the presence of the Buddha. Indeed, marvels of the relics were critical in the widespread pagoda constructions in medieval China. It is said that Emperor Wen, So it is said that Emperor Wen of the Sui dynasty, you can see the dates there, was once given a bag of relics by an Indian monk. Marvelously, the relics inside the bag multiplied by themselves. Emperor Wen therefore erected a pagoda to enshrine the relics. One night, I quote, and there's a Chinese text right there. So one night, I quote, "The spirit radiance emitted from inside, circling the pagoda clockwise from its base until its finial," end quote. So this is actually quite graphic, right? So it's a light coming from the base and then go all the way to the top. Awed by the power of the relics, the emperor ordered the nationwide distribution of the miraculously grown relics to 112 monasteries, each building a pagoda to honor the relics. None of the 112 pagodas survived, but they were said to have been built uniformly. A stylistically close example is preserved in Nara, Japan, namely the 5-story pagoda in Horyuji. Essentially, the relic pagoda comprises a sacred interior framed by an exterior. The interior contains the relic depository marked by the central pole, rising from the underground crypt until it turns into a finial on top of the pagoda. The Sanskrit term is called chatra. So this is a central pole kind of echoing that the legend, how the light comes up from the base all the way to top, right? So and completely invisible from outside, the central pole's vertical rise is manifested through the multiple levels moving upwards, one above the other. Building pagoda was one of the most effective, meritorious activities of Buddhist devotion. Yet, Buddhist teachings explicitly explain that the infinite benefits one gets from constructing pagodas lie in the pagoda's capacity to enshrine sacred relics inside. To activate the pagoda's merit-making mechanism entails ritual circumambulation around the sacred structures as a way of venerating the holy relics inside. So the image on your left, you can see that image. There's an icon inside there as well, but the icon is considered as kind of the figural manifestation of the relics inside the pagoda. The circular motion embodies the religiosity of the monument by localizing its sacred center right here and now, making the significance of the Buddha's nirvana and power more perceivable. So an example of this ritual function and mechanism is the stone relic pagoda of the Qixia Monastery near today's Nanjing. The pagoda, first built in wood, was one of the 112 pagodas constructed to contain the relics distributed by Emperor Wen of the Sui, discussed earlier. It was rebuilt in stone in the early 10th century after the wooden structures collapsed. The stone pagoda is a 5-level octagonal structure with a tall base. It has a tall base. You can see that there is a 3.9 meters and a finial. The first level is much taller than the upper 4 levels with a decreased diameter from the lower level upward. The first level has 4 entrances facing 4 cardinal directions, guarded by celestial warriors carved on the other 4 sides. Small seated Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are carved on the exterior of the higher levels, representing the broader Buddhist cosmology. Approaching the pagoda, you can see that approaching the pagoda, one could see the bottom of the entrance slightly above the eye level, but the well-guarded closed doors suggest a sacred interior that is not to be entered. Instead, one would see the base's waist, whose 8 sides are carved with 8 critical moments of the Buddha's career. For example, I'm showing you 2 right here. The one on the lower is the conception of Nara, so it's a Buddha's mother, and then the one on top is Nirvana on the right, so the death of the Buddha, and then the one on the image on the left will be the cremation itself. So the 8 panels. So from the birth all the way to the death of the Buddha in clockwise fashion. So, all right. So approaching the Buddha. I'm sorry. So viewing the 8 panels, following the path of the Buddha's life, induces a ritual circumambulation, while one's mindfulness takes a vertical rise until reaching the pinnacle. In so doing, one activates the presence of the Buddha by circling the relics hidden at the center and their religious potency to benefit one's spiritual advancement and karma. So with this ritual practice revolving around the relic pagodas, I will now return to our topic, the textual pagodas. So a close comparison should prove that the textual pagoda and the Qixia Monastery pagoda share basic formal characteristics. Both have a large base that supports a tall first level and 4 shorter upper levels, topped by a finial, a popular style of the relic pagodas around the 9th and 10th century. Right, so, and then the 2 characters, 佛说, literally Buddha says, appear at the topmost center. Underneath is a red dotted curved line linking the 4 characters at each end, which read the sutra title, hot sutra of the perfection of wisdom. Together, the top portion crowning the pagoda acknowledges that the sutra will unfurl as the Buddha speaks. However, the scripture doesn't start from the pinnacle. Instead, it begins from it begins from the character on the right beneath the entrance and ends with the character to its left, following a winding but symmetrically designed maze indicated by the red dotted lines. So I'm going to demonstrate a little bit. So if we start from the blue line, so you can see the red line, you can see how this reading goes zigzag, go all the way and then go out. Right, and then to end, I'm gonna skip the middle part to end this reading. So you can come in from the right side, go exactly the mirror image, go all the way to the blue line. So you can see how symmetrical the design is. And then and one should note that since the pagoda is made up of the characters, reading them turns the structure in space into a temporal construct. Keeping the temporal aspect in mind, I propose to break the reading sequence into 3 sections from left to right. Each section starts from the base and goes around the upper levels clockwise before returning to the base. So you can see, from the red, you can see that how it goes from here, right to left and coming back, and picking up is the second one from here, and it goes all the way up to the top. So when it goes to top, you kind of switch the directions. Go all the way there and then switch the direction and coming down over here on the other side. And then we're picking up from there and then we'll be here. So, and then the blue line right there, and it goes again, from the other side and coming back to the middle. And then it forms the entire itinerary. So the textual acrobatics, I argue, simulate the ritual circumambulation around the sacred center and activate symbolism in a vertical rise from the base until reaching the pinnacle, especially the central one. You can see that how it goes all the way to the top and coming down, right? So and then further, this simulation is conceived to resonate with pagodas in reality, as the textual pagoda is designed using a similar modular system as the actual pagoda. For example, the height of the Qixia Monastery pagoda on your left and the height of the textual pagoda both use half of the column height on their respective first levels as a controlling module. So you can see that, the one on the left there is a 9, if you count it, so 9A. Each A is half column, and the one on the right is my example. So you can see that's altogether it's 10 A's. And there's another module used in the textual pagoda. So if you use the width of the base as a diameter, it goes all the way top. So it goes, it kind of covers everything, right? So as such, we may take the textual pagoda as a 2-scale model that on the one hand essentializes the ritual practice of the Vedic pagoda, and on the other brings about the religious experience and benefits the practice like an actual pagoda in miniature. In this light, it makes sense that the text starts from the bottom of the entrance, assuming that's where a visitor could see first when approaching the pagoda virtually. So you can see how from there, from the base, and then in the actual pagoda, you're also starting from the base. Unlike other architectural types, pagodas have a unique agentic power by engaging ritual circumambulation around their structures. Constructed for holding the sacred depository, pagodas nonetheless cannot fully operate as a sacred center and merit generative mechanism until they are ritually switched on, so to speak, by circumambulation. A 9th century account records that inside a certain Qianfu monastery in Tang capital Chang'an, a pagoda was painted with images of patriarchs in walking posture around its exterior, as if they were circumambulating the pagoda. Indeed, the ritual engagement in circling around its structure is part and parcel of what defines a pagoda, to such an extent that the images of walking monks painted around the structure could achieve the intended religious goals. This might also be the case for the textual pagodas. instead of walking monks. The text of the Heart Sutra is arranged in such a way that the characters now serve to evoke virtual circumambulation. As such, the sutra text is not only the interior content of the pagoda, but also the source of the power that makes the pagoda work. The remaining question is, could Buddhist texts be understood with such a power? So as many have discussed, sutra commend copying and promise great rewards for doing so. Some scholars address the set of textual pagodas by seeing them as part of the sutra transcription practice. So the one on your right, so for example, the one on your right is typical kind of the transcribing sutra practice, and a lot of scholars are also seeing the textual pagoda in that regard. However, if we suppose copying a scripture must follow the correct textual sequence to avoid losing the semantic meanings, transcribing the text to form the pagoda images doesn't meet the expectation. So look closely. We should see how the text was written with vertical and horizontal lines and rows aligned perfectly. And yet the number of red dots between any two characters varied. So the red dot seems like, they put it in there afterwards. So it is likely that though so it becomes clear that the characters were written first before the guiding red dots were applied. Then it is likely that though one reads the text from the beneath of the pagoda entrance, in actual writing, the copyist would follow the typical convention of Chinese script, starting from the top, the pinnacle, and moving from right to left until reaching the bottom. In other words, the copyist privileged the pagoda shape and proportion over sutra's semantic content. The copying of the text itself will not generate any meanings until the red dots were applied to form a reading itinerary. In other words, copying the textual pagoda was not meant to transcribe the sutra only. To understand this unusual method of copying, I propose to see the textual pagoda in a spellcraft practice that was developed swiftly in Chinese Buddhism from the 8th century onwards. The Heart Sutra addresses the fundamental emptiness of the all phenomena. Its text is usually divided into 3 sections, which coincide with the 3 sections of the reading itinerary proposed earlier. The first section asks what emptiness is, followed by the exegesis of the emptiness in the second section. And the third section urges practitioners to chant the spells and mantras included at the end of the text to obtain the perfect wisdom. It is thus essential to see Heart Sutra in the rise of the spell craft practice. The spells involve incantation, but it was around this time that written spells by themselves were considered as potent as their spoken counterparts. Interestingly, the written spells, along with their scripture explanations, were seen during the 8th and 9th centuries, arranged in pictorial form, usually in a square, circle, spiral, expanding outward from the center. They appear to be diagrammatic simulations of the spell incantation rite, sanctioned by the central deity or symbols. For example, the deity right here, you have the symbol in next example right in the middle. So and in the middle, there's also a character right there. That's kind of a sound, N, or it's pronounced as N. So in the last example on your right, the spiral visualizes a bursting sound of the initial incantatory syllable at the center, followed by the rest of the spell simultaneously recounted to enact the transformative efficacy of the initial vocal burst. In a sense, the pictorial form of the written text is decisive in turning the spells into powerful agents of the ritual efficacy. I admit that the textual pagoda is not entirely comparable since it takes a figural form rather than a geometric formation. However, we should not overlook the shared spellcraft technique and logic. The scripture and the written spells are arranged in pictorial formation such that they are no longer text per se. Rather, they are words in action, to evoke visions of a ritual site or sacred space for incantatory rites to take place. In the case of textual pagoda, the written incantation as words in action iterates the veneration of pagoda by following the reading sequence to circumambulate and thus create visually the sacred space of the pagoda even without a practitioner reciting the text. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Wei, for that absolutely fascinating presentation. Our next speaker is Laurette Godinas, who is an expert in textual criticism, paleography, and the literature of the Middle Ages, the Spanish Golden Age, and colonial New Spain. She's involved in several research projects, including homiletic literature in Latin and Spanish in the last century of colonial Mexico, graphic practices in New Spain, normative guidelines, and writing realities. And I've lost my place, the Proverbs of Seneca, and she has co-coordinated along with Pablo Mora, the collective project, the Bibliography of Bibliographies, towards creating a model for the history and digital edition of the masterpieces of Mexican bibliography. The Biblioteca Mexicana of Eguiara and the Biblioteca Hispanoamericana Septentrional of Beristain. And she is currently responsible for the project, the PAPIT project, Masterpieces of Mexican Bibliography, a digital repository of Mexican written culture. She is an investigator at the Instituto de Investigaciones Bibliográficas of the UNAM. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here today in front of this audience of experts. And I thank the organizers for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak about Eguiara and his tireless work in defense of the cultural production of the New Spain. This is also a special moment for me since it's the first time I carry out a lecture on Eguiara in English. So please impute any error to me and don't blame Eguiara. Talking about the Library of Babel, Jorge Luis Borges expressed himself in these terms. The examples made it possible for the librarian of genius to discover the fundamental law of the library. This thinker observed that all the books, no matter how diverse they might be, are made up of the same elements: the space, the period, the comma, the 22 letters of the alphabet. He also alleged that a fact which travelers have confirmed: in the vast library, there are no two identical books. From these two incontrovertible premises, he deduced that the library is total and that its shelves register all the possible combinations of the two orthographical symbols, a number which, although vast, is not infinite. In other words, all that is given to express in all languages. Everything. The minutely detailed history of the future, the archangel's autobiographies, the faithful catalogue of the library, thousands and thousands of false catalogues, the demonstration of the fallacy of those catalogues, the commentary on the gospel, the commentary on the commentary on that gospel, the true story of our death, the translation of all books in all languages, the interpolation of every book in all books. When it was proclaimed that the library contained all books, the first impression was one of extravagant happiness. After taking this citation for introducing his seminal essays, Libraries Without Walls, Roger Chartier, nevertheless, had to point out that the dream of a library in a variety of configurations that would bring together all accumulated knowledge and all the books ever written can be found throughout the history of Western civilization. It underlaid the constitution of great princely, ecclesiastical, and private libraries. It's justified the tenacious search for rare books, lost editions, and texts that had disappeared. It commanded architectural projects to construct edifices capable of welcoming the world's memory. Bringing together the entire written patrimony of humanity in one place proves an impossible task, though. Impossible, although many bibliographers have been trying to carry it out again and again. When dealing with the many semantic possibilities of the term biblioteca, Roger Chartier insists on the fact that the library or bibliothèque can be in French a place destined for putting books in it, a collection of several works of the same nature, a category that included periodical publications such as the French Bibliothèque universelle et historique, published in France between 1686 and 1693, in a sense that, although it's not mentioned in the Dictionnaire of the French Academy, Chartier's dictionary describes as the books that contain the catalogue of the books in the bibliothèque. A similar review of the semantic extent of the word in Spanish was carried out recently by Hugo Daniel Lopez in his article Book Collections and Libraries, a Conceptual Question, published by the prestigious review about book history and written culture, Bibliográficas, of our institute. Although Chartier asserts that 3 of those works are essential to understand the history of this semantic shift, the Catalogus Illustrium Virorum Germaniae sui ingenis et lucubrationibus omnifariam exornantium, built by Johann Tritheim in Mainz in 1495, Konrad Gessner's Bibliotheca Universalis, which has a subtitle Catalogus Omnium Scriptorum Locupletissimus in Tribus Linguis Latina, Graeca et Hebraica, printed in Zurich in 1545, and the Illustrium Majoris Britanniae Scriptorum by John Bale, which was published in Ipswich in 1548. Only Gessner wanted to overcome the national boundaries, declaring from the title on the universality of his work, Bibliotheca Universalis, and at the same time reducing its scope to the objects written in the most important and prestigious vehicular languages for culture, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. In any case, Gessner proved to establish a model taken from the medieval habit to sort by first or baptismal name and not family names of bibliographical repertories that include ancient and contemporary writers as well, and all kinds of authors, both well-known and less learned. Gessner's hard work for bibliographical projection of the written culture was continued in his Pandectarum sive partitionum libri 2021, published in Zurich in 1548, and traditionally considered as a continuation of the Bibliotheca Universalis, although it's a rather encyclopedic work divided in thematic categories of the artes and scientias, following the scheme of medieval pedagogy, going from trivium and quadrivium to Christian theology. And after him, by the French gentleman Lacroix du Maine, who published in 1584 a kind of epitome or abstract called Premier Volume de la Bibliothèque, that was in fact part of the more comprehensive series called Grande Bibliothèque Française, in which he included, following Gessner's model, a part of Pandectes Latine et Françoise, or Française, divided thematically according to the structure of liberal arts. According to Archer Taylor in his History of Bibliographies of Bibliography, we owe Philippe Labbé, author of the Bibliotheca Bibliothecarum, the first review of an already fertile discipline dedicated to the construction of notices about the rich cultural heritage of the Western culture. Nevertheless, his work did not have the impact it should have had amongst his contemporaries. One particular entry, curiously not referring to a particular author, but to a kind of institution, is particularly important in his review, the concept of bibliotheca, in which he shows a particularly knowledgeable understanding of their diversity and proposed a rather useful classification in 6 categories. The first one, bibliothecae that are named for a place, well, allocis dictae, Augustana, Floraciensis, and so on. 2, bibliothecae named for person, a personis, like the Bodleiana. 3, bibliothecae named after their rulers, a principibus, such as Regis Gallica, Caesaria, and so on. 4, bibliothecae named for religious orders, a ordinibus sacris, Augustiana, Carmelitica, and so on. 5, bibliothecae according to the subject about which they deal, a materia quam tractant, chymica, concionatoria, juridica, and so on. And 6, bibliothecae according to their arrangement or like circumstances, a forma similibus ve circumstantiis, classica selecta universalis, and so on. This taxonomy is especially important to understand the reflection I should like to introduce today about how Juan José de Eguiara, known as the first Mexican bibliographer, constructs his Bibliotheca Mexicana, the first systematic intent to account for the production of written culture after the cultural clash that converted the Western culture as dominating in Hispanic America, and more particularly in the northern part of it, a place known as the Virreinato de la Nueva España. As the name of this very important bibliographical repertory makes evident, Eguiara's Bibliotheca Mexicana belongs to the first category above mentioned, that of the Bibliothecae Aloquis Dictae. Before delivering an analysis of its pertinence for the reflection I propose to offer in this paper, I consider necessary to give a little more information about this really important work of our cultural heritage. Juan José de Eguiara y Eguren was born as the eldest of a big family of whom all the male, except one, devoted themselves to the service of God. Although we do not possess a lot of information about his early years, later testimonies affirm he was a very hard-working boy who constructed patiently his university career at the University of Mexico, in which he served inclusive as his rector. As Eguiara himself tells in the first and second of his 20 prologues, a profusion that's very important to understand fully how meaningful Eguiara's work is, the original purpose of the Bibliotheca Mexicana was a vindication of the insult brought about probably unconsciously by Emmanuel Martí, the dean of Alicante's main church, when giving an advice to a young pupil who had written him a letter in order to ask for advice about where to continue his studies, Rome or the New Spain. Eguiara tells then how the reading of this sentence upset him so much that he wanted a space for response and started building on a collective basis. This is by means of a profuse correspondence and at the same time a personal effort to consult the materials he had to hand to the biggest compilation of authors mainly, but also 23 institutions, such as the cathedrals of Mexico, Puebla, or Valladolid, cities as Puebla, ecclesiastic departments, and even educational institutions as the University of Mexico, the first of the entries known, as you can see in the slide, as Academia Mexicanensis, who had produced, as explicitly exposed in the subtitle of the repertory, some work published or unpublished in any language. The textual and editorial history of the Bibliotheca Mexicana is rather complex. Eguiara, who put on a printing house in his own house to guarantee the printing of this huge bibliography, was only able to print the first volume that included the letters ABC and correspond to the manuscripts 44 and 45 of the National Library of Mexico, its pretext. The letters D to J remained unpublished in 4 manuscripts that belong to the Mexican historian Genaro Garcia, whose early passing compelled his widow to sell his very rich library to the University of Texas, where it gave rise to what we know today as the Natty Lee Benson Library. We have no textual evidence of the entries from M to Z, although the analysis of the leitmotif of old age as an answer to the questionings about the early deterioration of the American ingenium quotes those quotes give example that range from Matthias to Thomas, pointing out that the biobibliographies from M to T were at least ready as drafts. Regarding the content, as a matter of fact, the Bibliotheca Mexicana has 2 subtitles. The first one is Bibliotheca Mexicana, sive Historia eruditorum virorum, qui in America boreali nati, velali bigeniti, in ipsam domicilio aut studiis asciti, quavis lingua scripto aliquid tradiderunt, which means Mexican Library or History of the Scholars who, born in Northern America or in other places but settled down in it for residence or studies, produce something written in any language. Then Eguiara delivers the second one, Eorum praesertim, qui pro fide catholica et pietate amplianda fovendaque, egregie factis, et quibus vis scriptis florere editis aut ineditis, a clarification that helps to make clear the inclusion poetics that underlies the whole work. Above all, the history of those who, in order to make grow and encourage the Catholic faith, flourished by giving birth to well-done written works that were published or remained in manuscript versions. Of course, these two subtitles are very important since they outline what we can call a poetics of inclusion that profiles which kind of works can or cannot be taken as part of his bibliographical repertoire, this Bibliotheca in bibliographical sets. In another paper, I tried to demonstrate how this poetics of inclusion determined in very reduced number of authors of drama able to make their way to the entries of Eguiara's repertory and the exclusion of authors with a rather profuse production, such as, for instance, Eusebio Bella. But the second one also sketches out the kind of material this library without walls that his author called Mexicana was made of. Or, in other words, what were the materials on which Eguiara rested to put together his magnum opus. If we follow Taylor's taxonomy, the pillars of Eguiara's Bibliotheca Mexicana are, since the most important part of the community who have created the works compiled belongs, according to the poetics of inclusion, to the clergy, the Bibliothecae ab ordinibus sacris, or religious bibliographies that were prepared by the different religious orders to show off the relevance of their production. Maybe the most important, because on the top of the list made up by his brother Francisco after his death is the Jesuit bibliography entitled Bibliografía Selecta, composed by Possevino, in a clear view of orthodox combat to the reformist ideas, which is usually mentioned for Jesuitic authors before the end of the 16th century. But Possevino, mentioned in this edition of the postmortem description of his book made by brother Francisco Eguiara as Posquino, undoubtedly a polygraphical misreading for Possevino, by the editors of the tome 5 called Monumenta Eguiarense of the recent edition of the Bibliotheca Mexicana, is not the only source for the information about Jesuits. Pedro de Ribaneira and his De Scriptoribus Societatis Jesu, whose first edition was published in Napoli after 2 years of writing and extensive peer review, of which Eguiara's testament contains un volumen en folio, is also an important source. Eguiara was also a lector of San Juan de San Antonio's Bibliotheca Universa Franciscana, of which he possessed 3 volumes, according to the same document. And of course, he recounts upon Ketif's work, organizing the projection of the written production of Dominicans, most of the time mentioned by Eguiara as Echar, because this latest name, as the one who actually finished and published this volume, is the most disseminated. Another relevant source of information for his compilation of the authors and works that have been an essential part of the written culture of the New Spain dominion are the chronicles of religious orders. It's important here to mention that, as occurred above when we talk about the Bibliothecae ab ordinibus sacris, many of those were owned, or at least could be consulted personally by Eguiara y Eguren during the process of research carried out for the composition of the Bibliotheca Mexicana. The Dominican play, the same way as the Franciscans, a huge role in this transmission of information about the history of their members as authors of important or not so important works. This is why the most mentioned works in the Bibliotheca Mexicana are, on one side, the Franciscan chronicles such as Medina's Crónica de la Santa Provincia de San Diego de México de Religiosos Descalzos, edited in 1682 by Juan Rivera, and also Betancourt's Teatro Mexicano, subtitled Descripción breve de los sucesos ejemplares de la Nueva España en el Nuevo Mundo Occidental de las Indias, and more particularly in the part that was published separately in 1697 called Crónica de la Provincia del Santo Evangelio de México. And for the author of the northern part, Arlegui and his Crónicas de la Provincia Zacatecana de San Francisco. And if it seems relatively logical that his source on Dominican history is Agustín Dávila y Padilla's Historia de la Fundación y Discurso de la Provincia de Santiago de México de la Orden de Predicadores, it is perhaps more interesting to observe, in order to highlight how exhaustive Eguiara's search for sources for his repertoire was, that he also made use of Alonso Franco's manuscript chronicle, considered as the natural continuation of Padilla's text, of which he says in the unpublished part of the Bibliotheca Mexicana Austin manuscripts in the description of Fray Fernando Bazán's biography that it seems he was born in Spain. I quote, pues leemos en una historia manuscrita de Alonso Franco de que abajo hablaremos, que hizo en Sevilla sus primeros estudios. I translate because it's in Latin, no, in the original version. A bit further, in Fray Francisco de Alvarado's entry, he mentions at the end of this manuscript that the catalogue of authors contained in the unpublished work is he mentioned that the catalogue of authors contained in the unpublished work. It's interesting to observe that, as the Mexican bibliographer José María de Agreda Sánchez says in the introduction to his edition in the 19th century of the Segunda parte de la historia de la provincia de Santiago de México y de la Orden de Predicadores en la Nueva España, that the text remained unpublished not because of a lack of resource. Agreda asserts that it was no por el fuerte gasto y dificultades de la imprenta como creyeron nuestros bibliógrafos Eguiara y Beristain, pues el convento de esta ciudad tenía cuantiosos bienes y los religiosos bastantes amigos, although he doesn't give a clear-cut reason for this failed editorial history, and spends the next lines to tell how Agustín Fischer, the greatest villain of Mexican bibliography after his epic theft of Andrade's books that had been bought by the Emperor Maximiliano to make up the Imperial Library between 1864 and 1867, wanted to steal this manuscript, but was prevented from doing so by the careful zeal of Padre Nicolás Arias. Jesuits also have their chronicles, quoted many times in the Bibliotheca Mexicana. Florencia's Historia de la Provincia de la Compañía Jesús de la Nueva España, published in 1694 by José Guillena Carrascoso. To this we have to add, because Eguiara also rests in many occasions on this pillar to authorize the entries of the Bibliotheca, the Menologio de los varones más señalados en la perfección religiosa de la provincia de la Compañía de Jesús de Nueva España, that was authorized by Juan Pablo de Oliva and augmented by Juan Antonio de Oviedo for the 1746 edition, of whom we conserve the original edition that was part of Eguiara's library. It's what you see, the last example. You have something manuscript, and that's Eguiara's signature in the book. I certainly do not want to omit, as a qualification of the above, other works that were fundamental for the construction of the Biblioteca Mexicana, although they can't be considered as part of the two categories I described earlier. One of those is Feijóo's Teatro Crítico Universal, of which Eguiara, according to the inventory mentioned above, had a copy in his library. Nevertheless, the volume 3, in which he speaks on the ingenium of the Americans. This mention is particularly interesting since it shows how Eguiara got informed about the work of the controversial Asturian author, and doubly thanks to the interest and curiosity aroused by the cause of his Cuban friend Francisco Ignacio Sigala, who would have even published in the Mexican Bibliotheca press, managed by Eguiara himself. And that's the Carta al Ilustrísimo Reverendísimo Fray Benito Jerónimo Feijóo by Francisco Sigala. This stands linked in the 1760 letter to a topic pertaining to the philosophy of science, and the tone of refutation are very similar to the way in which Eguiara employs in prologues 8 and 9, to which he refers in bibliographical entries throughout his work, to reject Feijóo's position on the issue of possible precocity and early perenniality of American ingenia. Eguiara's Biblioteca Mexicana illustrates the potential that a paper library has for tracing the cultural history of a nation. A library without walls that is built from the adequate positioning of some ingenios, personae, institutiones, in a context that's built like a real house, with pillars, the religious libraries and other bibliographies, walls, the chronicles of orders in the case of the numerous members belonging to the regular clergy, the lives of saints, and other works in the case of the laymen, who are still a minority considering the poetics of inclusion, and other sources. In this sense, the contrasted review of Eguiara's library as recorded in his will, and the entries of the Biblioteca Mexicana in a global and transversal reading continues to be essential in order to give a fair value to the immense work of the pioneer of Mexican bibliography. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurette. We are on to our final talk of this panel, and then we will have a break, I promise. Sorry, Will. Our next speaker is Will Hansen, the Roger and Julia Baskey's Vice President for Collections and Library Services and curator of the Newberry of Americana at the Newberry Library, where we will all be so glad to see things tomorrow. He began his career in libraries at the Newberry in 2003 as a circulation assistant, and then in 2004 as the library's reference assistant. From 2007 to May 2014, he was assistant curator of collections at Duke University's David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library, and he returned to the Newberry in June 2014 as director of reader services and curator of Americana. He has published articles on the Newberry's Indigenous Studies collections, Herman Melville, active learning with primary source materials, archives of born digital materials, and other topics. And he's curated exhibitions at the Newberry, including Hamilton, the History Behind the Musical, Melville, Finding Americans at Sea, Viva la Libertad, Latin America and the Age of Revolutions, and Indigenous Portraits Unbound, which we're going to get to see tomorrow. And his title today is Sacred According to Whom? Welcome.
Okay, I'm going to be brief, I promise. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you to all our collaborators at UNAM and the University of Chicago who have organized this colloquium. I am honored to be here. For those who celebrate, Happy Independence Day. Viva Mexico. Viva la Independencia. It's also my birthday, so it's a holiday near and dear to my heart. Thank you. I am here today to talk about the Newberry's approach to culturally sensitive Indigenous materials, materials that might be considered sacred. In accordance with the policy I'm talking about, I won't actually be showing you images of the materials that have been identified as culturally sensitive. But the first slide here shows something that's already been shown today, actually. One of the best known items in our Latin American and Indigenous Studies collections, a hand-colored copy of the map of Tenochtitlan that accompanied the second letter of Hernan Cortez, discussing the siege of the city from Nuremberg in 1524. This detail, of course, shows the central temple district of Tenochtitlan, a sacred space of the Mexica people. You are all familiar with this image. If you want to see it tomorrow, go ahead and request it. It's up in the reading room. We've already covered this in a very similar way, so I will basically skip over it, except to say the last sentence, which is that as a Chicago institution, the Newberry feels it is its responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations and other Indigenous peoples on whose lands we are situated and whose materials we hold. Who are we? Most of you hopefully are familiar with the Newberry, but if you're not, very briefly, this is a little bit about who we are. Of course, a library or archives may also be considered a sacred space by some, a temple of learning, of language, of the written word, of the book. As with many such spaces, what seems or is deemed sacred by or to some may feel or be oppressive, restrictive, or painful to others. And that's what I'm talking about here is part of that tension and part of our ways of trying to rectify it. But the Newberry in general, for the past 137 years, we have been an independent research library, free and open to the public, focused on the humanities, collecting primary sources such as rare books, manuscripts, and maps, making them available for use to whoever might want to use them. Like I said, we are free and open to the public, but we are not a public library. We are a private institution. We receive no governmental funding to keep our operations going, although we do get grants for fellowships and things like that. We define research broadly at the Newberry. We assist thousands of readers from a wide variety of backgrounds every year and host 150 to 200 groups for presentations of collection materials of interest to them each year as well. These groups include classes, of course, but also community groups, official delegations from various countries, visiting dignitaries of various kinds, The image you're seeing here is of a blessing ceremony. This came up earlier, conducted in 2011 by the Maya of Chichicastenango, Guatemala, for another of the best known items in the Newberry's Indigenous Studies collections, the transcription and translation of the sacred text of the Quiche Maya, the Popol Vuh. It was transcribed in Quiche and translated into Spanish by the Dominican Father Francisco Jimenez and his indigenous collaborators in the early 18th century. We have had 3 visits from groups from Guatemala and 2 from Chichicastenango specifically to bless the document. And happy to talk about the context of the altar that was prepared and what we went through to get that allowed, if people are interested. I will skip over this very quickly. This just gives you a sense of the overall size and scope of the collections at the Newberry, which focus on the past 6 centuries of human experience, especially in the Americas and in Europe. The Indigenous Studies collections at the Newberry are one of the 11 main collecting areas that we cover. And as this slide indicates, the American Indian and Indigenous Studies collections at the Newberry are hemispheric. They include histories and cultures from North, Central, and South America within their scope, though as you might imagine, greater emphasis is placed on North America given where we are. It is one of the largest such library collections in the world and rare for its broad geographic and chronological scope. Everything you're seeing here, by the way, is from the Newberry's collections. So anything that sparks your interest, let me know. I'll be happy to talk more about it in the Q&A if you want. All of this is context for talking about culturally sensitive materials for Indigenous peoples. So what does that mean? What am I talking about? What are culturally sensitive materials? You can see a basic definition here: tangible or intangible property and knowledge that pertains to the distinct values, beliefs, and ways of living for a culture. It often includes property and knowledge that is not intended to be shared outside the community of origin. That comes from the 2007 Protocols for Native American Archival Materials, which we'll come back to in a minute. The image back here, by the way, is from a 1576 document related to an estate dispute in Xochimilco on amate paper with both glyphs or pictographs and Nahuatl and Spanish writing in the Latin orthography. It's a great thing. And if you want to see that, you can see that tomorrow too. Most people associate museums more closely with objects of cultural sensitivity like I'm talking about, but such objects certainly can reside in libraries and archives as well. Examples appear here. Texts or recordings of songs and stories that have specific protocols within their home cultures for their use, such as being intended to only share at certain times of year or for certain members of the culture. Photographs of tribal burial places or the actual physical remains of ancestors, or descriptions or depictions of ceremonies such as dances or formulae for sacred medicines, for instance. Of course, all cultures have materials that they consider sacred. So why is this focused on Indigenous cultures? That is related to the processes by which Indigenous knowledge and culture were extracted from their communities into colonial institutions. In the Newberry Library's case, its collections related to Indigenous peoples of the Americas began in earnest with the collection of the man you're seeing in the center here and also on the right, Edward E. Ayer. Ayer was a white man born in 1841 in Kenosha, Wisconsin. He grew up in Harvard, Illinois, and traveled west in 1860. While stationed in Arizona during the U.S. Civil War, he became fascinated with the histories of Mexico in particular and of Indigenous peoples of the Americas more broadly. He tells this story a number of times in his lifetime and actually inscribes into his book that the first book he purchased for his collection was a copy of Prescott's Conquest of Mexico. After the war, Ayer became a lumber magnate, providing ties to the railroads as they were expanding west and displacing Indigenous peoples along the way. He used some of his wealth to amass his collections of books, manuscripts, and artifacts focused on Indigenous peoples of the Americas and their interactions with settler colonists, especially the early contacts between these peoples. He donated his books, manuscripts, and artworks related to Indigenous studies to the Newberry in 1911. The artifacts he donated to the Field Museum, and it became part of the foundation of their Native American collections there. Ayer is rightly remembered and honored as a generous benefactor to the Newberry, the Field Museum, and other Chicago institutions. His collecting helped draw attention to and eventually made made available for public use important historical materials for Indigenous history at a time when so many major American collectors and institutions were focused on European art, illuminated manuscripts, and early printed books. However, it would be wrong to disregard the complicated, sometimes fraught history of white individuals and organizations collecting materials related to Indigenous peoples. Ayer and many other collectors of the Gilded Age were able to build their significant collections of art, books, manuscripts, and other research materials thanks to brutally extractive and in many cases exploitative business practices, all set against the backdrop of ongoing wars against Indigenous people defending their lands and rights. You can see the quote from Carolyn Kastner's article about Ayer here to somewhat give that same argument. The image I'm showing here is the bookplate that was created for Ayer's collection at the Newberry. This is still the bookplate that appears in many books at the Newberry to this day. I'm about to read a statement that we first used in the Viva la Libertad exhibition in 2021 that was just mentioned, focused on the wars for independence in Latin America in the early 19th century. The Newberry and Edward Ayer acquired the items in its Indigenous Studies collections in good faith from what were believed to be their proper owners, yet we also acknowledge the long history of removal of cultural heritage from American Indian and Indigenous communities to colonizing nations and institutions. Such removals sometimes occurred through pillage, theft, coercion, exploitative purchase, and other inappropriate means. We recognize this historical context and seek to build reciprocal relationships with the communities from which these items and the knowledge they carry came. Today, we continue to grow the collection to include materials representing Native writers, artists, and activists from throughout the Western Hemisphere, while intentionally working with communities to contextualize and ethically steward materials within the collection. So that leads directly into the actual sort of policies and procedures I'm talking about here. As mentioned earlier, the Newberry's policy related to culturally sensitive Indigenous materials is built upon the first Archivist Circle's Protocols for Native American Archival Materials, which were developed at a 2006 meeting at Northern Arizona University and published in 2007. The protocols were controversial in the library and archives world upon publication, remain so to this day in some circles. They were not endorsed by major professional organizations such as the American Library Association and the Society of American Archivists until 2018. If you're curious about why, ask in the Q&A. I'll skip it for now. Here are some of the main recommendations within the protocols. Ooh, this didn't quite. It's a little bit off, sorry. They include, in basic terms, recognition of the lack of Indigenous community involvement in most libraries' past practices and the damage that such a disconnection has done, actively seeking to repair that damage via consultation with Indigenous partners about how to handle the related collections that they steward, and the need for improved information and communication about the content within institutional collections and its cultural meanings. At the Newberry, these protocols have been put into effect in part through our policy for access to culturally sensitive Indigenous materials, which is available on our website. That includes an open call for input into identification of such materials in our collections, and an agreement that we will not display identified culturally sensitive materials on the Newberry website, exhibit them publicly, or show them to visiting classes or groups unless such uses are approved by the proper Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, typically called a THPO, or a similar official for the affected tribal nation or Indigenous community. So to come back to the title, who's actually deciding this? Who decides? Who decides what's sacred or culturally sensitive and how? It's important to note that anyone is welcome to suggest something for review as potentially culturally sensitive, and that a team of staff members consult on those suggestions as a first step, only as a first step. We seek to balance respect for Indigenous peoples' sovereignty and expertise with a respect for their time and the many demands on it. So given the size of our collection and the number of potential inquiries, we decide internally on a provisional designation of any published item as potentially culturally sensitive. For unique unpublished material, however, we actively reach out to a tribal official, usually the tribal historic preservation officer, to request consultation and determination of whether the material is culturally sensitive. It's worth noting how much this process is built around the United States and to some extent Canadian administrative structure for Indigenous tribal nations. It's less clear and consistent, at least less clear and consistent to us, who the appropriate person or people are to reach out to for consultation with specific Indigenous communities in Latin America. But we also hope to determine best practices to identify appropriate officials within Indigenous groups there. It's a big world to cover, though, and we know this is not going to happen overnight. When something is identified by tribal officials as culturally sensitive, our cataloging staff updates the appropriate catalog record or records with a note on the nature of the cultural sensitivity for all researchers. We seek the input of our Indigenous partners in crafting the specific phrasing of the notes in these cases. So you can see the sort of note that generally appears on such a record. It is also crucial to note that the identification of something as culturally sensitive does not necessarily mean that access to it is at all restricted. In most cases, it actually doesn't. It just means that we're telling people that it has been identified as potentially such, so they can make a decision for themselves on whether or not they feel it's appropriate to access it. As stated here, access is restricted only if a tribal official, like a TIPO, or other official determines that the content of culturally sensitive materials should never have been shared outside the community of origin. If that is the case, the Newberry restricts access to the appropriate uses by placing a traditional knowledge label in the catalog record, which is the sort of symbol that you see there, the box symbol, identifying the item as containing secret or sacred knowledge. I'm happy to talk more about those kinds of labels if you want, also in the Q&A. As stated here, although restricting access may seem counter to the mission of libraries or archives to some, we follow these steps out of respect for the rights of sovereign tribal nations and Indigenous communities over their own knowledge and culture. This approach also affects our current collecting of materials in this area. Our revised collecting policy states that we prioritize the collecting of materials created by or in collaboration with Indigenous people themselves, and that we do not collect culturally sensitive materials without consultation with the appropriate group. Likewise, we state that the archival record in this field should be primarily administered by tribal nations and groups themselves whenever possible, and that we seek to supplement that record in collaboration with Indigenous archives and archivists. In other words, we believe that in most cases, tribal archives, Indigenous communities should control those documentary records themselves to the extent possible, and we seek to help them to do that whenever we can. So in closing, we recognize the importance and even the sacredness of some of the materials that we steward, as well as the sacredness of the responsibility to help preserve and provide access to these materials. We are committed to doing so ethically and collaboratively with the Indigenous peoples whose stories they contain. The learning and knowledge and cultures embodied in these materials and the respect for them, this is where the sacredness of the library resides, if anywhere, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Will, for raising these incredibly important questions and drawing our attention to how the Newberry addresses them. Now, in an ideal world, we'd be having coffee, but I think we should have 5 minutes of conversation first. So if I could invite my 3 presenters up to the table, and we will see if there is any energy left. And if not, we can always fold questions after the next panel, but I might have does anyone have a question?
It's about the pagodas. I noticed that the image that you presented had the shape of a flower, and those it have a relationship, this shape of flower, with the text or with the smell or with a metaphor of a flower or something like that.
So when you say flower, do you refer to the after the itinerary that form that flower?
It's like a flower, and also you show another image, another document with a flower in the center.
That's right, yeah.
A talisman.
That's right, yeah. So the talisman, that's why the amulet. And the final one, the second example that you mentioned, the flower, the lotus flower, that definitely has the symbolic meaning to it, right? So and in the middle of the lotus flower, there's a syllable, that you can pronounce, right? So that's very important. But the itinerary, I'm not sure, because some people say that, they can see little small pagodas in there. Yeah, so you have the 1, 2, 3, and then there's more there. But I tend to, this is a much broader project. And then after Tangdan is there, there's more into, the 10th, 11th, 12th century CE. So, and then in my bigger, longer paper, those itinerary form that you see, I didn't show you to you. If I move that away from the pagoda, you will see that very, very interesting kind of the formation. And then around then, like a lot of talismans also it's kind of the scribbles, and in kind of the style of the cursive style of Chinese characters that you can really recognize. So that's for religious purpose, to kind of dispel evils and all that. So I'm trying to link these two things together. So that kind of the underneath form is also kind of the magic writing. Yeah, so
You can see it.
That's why. Yeah, exactly. So I can go back and see if the lotus is really in there. Yeah, but I didn't really think that way before, but I can go back and see. But I think the idea is that the underneath this network of red dots, I really form some kind of magic writing, and then that's kind of is also another layer of the power in there.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting. And I have a question for Will. When the material gets can you call it like that, a negative review, and will get a label with a box, would it then be possible to consult it again? What should a researcher do, or what's the procedure?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding your question right, if something is identified as sort of secret or sacred that should not actually have been shared outside the community, so we're actually sort of still working through how that will work, because we've had our first cases of it within the last year of a community actually saying this actually shouldn't have gotten out, shouldn't have been shared, and our whole reason for being as a library is sharing the material, right? So we have offered with those materials, we've said to the community, if you want them back, we will give them to you because it does no good sitting on the shelf if nobody's going to look at it. They may re-review it. They may say, actually, we're gonna back off on that. In that case, actually, it's also published material. So in some ways, that designation is kind of ceremonial because the information has been out there for decades now. We had a long conversation about, should we even bother with published material because it's out there? We nevertheless felt, out of respect for the community, that we should go ahead and make it an option for published material too, even if other libraries aren't going to follow it, even if it's already been out there and will continue to be out there. Our perspective is we are respecting the community's wishes by saying this is secret or sacred. It's not available for use outside the community. Now, there's nothing where we're saying no one can access it. So if a member of the tribal community comes to us and wants to access it at the library, we will provide access to it. They need to actually show identification, and in some cases, a letter or something from the tribal official saying they have access to this. They are allowed to use it. In many other cases, it will be available for use at some times and not others. There are many things that have those sort of seasonal protocols with them. So it's just a matter of when they're allowed to be used, not never. Right. Yes.
Thank you. Like a really quick follow-up, if I may there. Has it become an issue at all? Have you encountered, the question of with say something at the Newberry, is the thing culturally sensitive because of the information contained therein, or is it the actual physical thing?
So we have examples of both. It's actually more often the content than the material object, because we don't do a lot with artifacts. But there certainly are things where, I mean, everything we have, the materiality has some part of the meaning, but we don't have very many things that are artifactual in the way that a museum does. They're documents primarily. So it's mostly the content. But there are cases where that content and its carrier are deeply connected to each other. Like, we have Sahagun manuscripts, for instance, that are on native made paper. And that's really interesting for their sacred Christian texts, but they're actually on a material that could be considered sacred in terms of its production from indigenous people's perspectives. So that's one example of that kind of thing.
One more hand. And then Fernando, this way.
Oh, I have a question for William, for Will. When the members of the, I think it's the members of the indigenous municipality of Chichicastenango came to the library, I wonder if they did any type of request regarding the copy of the Popol Vuh, if there is any document or record about their visit at the library, if there was any communication or dialogue between representatives of the library and them. And yeah, I was curious about that.
Yeah. Is this on? Yes, it is. Okay. So I don't know if there's written records, but my understanding of that visit is that I have heard, I wasn't actually here for the 2011 visit. I was here for the 2015 visit. I have heard that the visit in 2011, that they may have intended to ask for the document back at the time, but did not end up doing that. So they visited in 2011 for the first time, saw the text, blessed the actual manuscript, thanked the Newberry staff for taking care of the document, keeping it safe, making it available for people to use, and then encouraged the staff to continue to do so. So the way things stand now, there has not been a request to return the manuscript. And they have continued to thank us for keeping it safe.
Okay.
My question is
Última
related with the two last, is the controversial thing. What's happened when a community wants back the document, the map, or the material? What happens in that case?
So that hasn't actually happened yet. We haven't had a request to return something. By and large, the communities we've worked with have said, you keep it for now. Who knows if that will change. Some tribal archives are farther along than others. In many cases, we've done what's called digital repatriation. So some places have said, we would love to get digital copies of this for use in our own archives or libraries, and we've done that. But they haven't actually asked for the physical items back. I'm sure it will happen eventually.
Yes.
It has actually happened with one of the few artifacts in the collection. We had a house plank from the Pacific Northwest of the Quaquaquaw people that came to Chicago for the World's Columbian Exposition and was at the Newberry for decades. We had held it in trust for the tribal nation for a few decades, actually. And then finally, funding came through to actually ship it across the continent to their cultural center. So that is something that has returned, but it's the kind of thing that is like a museum object. It's sort of an outlier in our collection.
I know we have so many questions, particularly for Will, but undoubtedly for Wei and Laurette as well. But I think we should ask them over coffee. So thank you, everybody, so very much for a really fascinating and thought-provoking set of papers.